Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this final session in a series of election discussions hosted by the Student Congress at Hope College. We appreciate your tuning in. My name is David Ryden. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department this evening, and I'm moderating this event. Very quick introductions on the far end. We have Professor Vicki Lynn Holmes, who teaches math and education. Next to her, John Yelding, who had a substantial career in public education before joining us here at Hope College in Hope's Education Department. Dr. Fred Johnson of our History Department and Dr. Jack Mulder of our Philosophy Department. The topic for tonight is race. This obviously has been front and center since the death of George Floyd in late May, and that really triggered a racial awakening, a reckoning, unrest, and it has really become one of the main kind of contextual backdrops of this election season. And so it's a worthy topic, obviously, for us to spend an hour on this evening. I'm hoping to cover a couple topics, but I realize I have professors in my midst, and so it will probably go where they want it to go. I am hoping to cover some policy questions. I think that especially implicate minority communities, and if we have time, those would be economic opportunity, policing, and education. Second, we want to talk about voting and race and minorities. And then thirdly, I really want to make sure we spend some time on racism and what the response has to be for people and communities of faith, and as Christians, how we respond to that. So that's sort of my hope, and as I said, you all are free to take things in any way you like as well. But I would like to start with this question of economic opportunity, which, just the persistent disparities that exist across racial lines, whether it's family income, intergenerational wealth, poverty rates, unemployment, and on and on. And those are especially accentuated in poor urban, largely minority communities. And so that's kind of the first question is, what can we do specifically? What are some policies, maybe some things outside the box that can generate real kind of economic opportunity for communities where the economic opportunities just seem to have vanished? I don't know who wants to take a shot at that.
Don't everyone speak at once. Well, I can
what do you think, Vicki Lynn?
I can tell you when I'm thinking about education, I think about this COVID and how we've gone online. And I think about the disparities of the have and the have-nots. I think about how in America we can tell how much success you're going to have by your education and your economic level. And so right now, our people of color and our poor, and especially the intersection between those two, are suffering mightily. And just things like free wireless internet, computers, basics, things like educational reform, because we know our educational system was not made for all, it was made for, in the beginning, white wealthy landowners. And so as we have widened that, we haven't in our heart made a structural change. We just redecorated. And so we need to have some structural changes to our education system. And also I like what Biden was saying regarding business opportunities, right? To money for business opportunities, just like we did in World War II, at the end of World War II, now doing something that for people of color. So that's my 2 cents, because I know that education is the passport to the future.
I do agree with that, but you can also pretty much know the likelihood of educational and economic success just by knowing what the zip code is that the child lives in,
Yes.
because that tends to define opportunity. And as I think about educational and academic policies, I do think there are some things that can be done, but I think it's a real challenge to think that you're going to fix educational and economic opportunity without first fixing social justice issues, because the other two come out of that. You know, you can't make it better by making one individual or a select group of people well-educated and socioeconomically advantaged, because we have historically done that. And in that process, we have convinced people that somehow they were such an exception that they pull themselves up by the bootstraps, which doesn't tell anything or do anything for people who don't have boots and are walking around barefooted. So in terms of policies, yes, we need better education opportunities. There's no question about that. Yes, you need opportunities for greater entrepreneurship on the part of minorities, but in and of themselves, that will tend to serve the few rather than the many. If I was going to point to one thing besides education that you could begin to do that's concrete policy, is stop replacing one set of projects with another. Just rebuilding, and the same people end up together. And we can say that does not inherently predict a lack of success, but we've seen it replicated generation after generation after generation now. What about more of a Habitat for Humanity approach, where we place homes in neighborhoods where they are surrounded by other, and please understand, I don't mean isolating people. You don't just need one person or one family here, but providing them with surroundings of this is what happens when you have your own home, when you have a job and you're supporting your family, and you take care of your lawns, and there's reasons to not neglect stuff because you've become hopeless, because you don't see any opportunity for progress. So I'll stop there. There's lots more, but.
Yeah. Fred or Jack want to add to that? Or? Go ahead, Jack.
Well, I can try. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that I've learned a lot from everybody here on this panel, and I'm just trying to offer some insights from where I sit, and I've got a lot to learn. But I'm a philosopher, so I like to kind of fan out to some big questions. And one of the things that I think it's just important to remember is that the way we think about something like race in this country, especially, isn't something that maps onto biological reality or anything like that. It's socially constructed, right? And part of that, part of what's going along with that is that since races aren't right, out there in the world, right? They're not sort of biological entities, right? We need to ask ourselves a question, and this is coming from an African-American philosopher, Paul C. Taylor. Basically, it's a paraphrase. It says, what links people of color to the social conditions they're in now that we know better than to rely on something like racial essence, right? Since there isn't something like that out there, right, we need to ask ourselves, what's the explanation, right, for disproportionately bad life chances for people of color, right? And the answer, of course, has to do with U.S. racial injustice and a lot of white supremacist thinking, right, about race, okay? And we can go into more of that, but for now, right, just in terms of thinking about economic opportunities, just from my perspective, I would think, okay, so to see what needs to be given back, right, it might be good to think about what's been taken away, right? And just some things that come to mind, right? People of color have been denied citizenship, right? We can think about a couple of cases in the 20s where race was deliberately constructed to make sure that white people were given opportunities and everybody else was not, right? People of color have been denied wages, of course, because of slavery, the most obvious case, right? And so we need to make sure that wages are livable, right? And invest and support businesses and organizations, right, of color to economically enrich those kinds of areas. And people of color have been denied mortgage loans, right? So we need policies to end things like predatory loans, right? And fair housing practices so that people of color can accumulate wealth over generations, because that tends to be how wealth is accumulated, right? So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head, but yeah.
So I've heard education, I've heard economic opportunity, I've heard housing, right? John used the word social justice. I'm not sure I see the distinction, right? I see these policies as social justice, right?
Yeah, they certainly are all a part of social justice.
Right. And so kind of all of a piece, right? I teach a little first-year seminar on the city of Detroit. Right, and just by virtue of, you said the zip code, right? The zip code where someone has, that is on their birth certificate, right? They're not at the starting line, right?
Correct.
They're significantly quite a ways back. In a city like Detroit, how do we generate like housing over a city that, right, over a large geography that has been hollowed out? How do we generate job opportunities when there's such low employment? And how do we educate kids so they're job qualified, right? So I do think education is sort of a starting point. If kids are going to have a chance to move into a job and sort of follow that path. So I'm going to ask a bit of a partisan question with respect to urban governance, right, which has largely been the province of Democratic administrations for some time. And I'm curious whether you think that we might have a more productive, creative sort of collaboration if we had maybe mayoral positions filled by someone of the other party. So I think of, at the statewide level, I think of Larry Hogan, who's kind of a centrist Republican, very popular, governing one of the more liberal states, Maryland, or Massachusetts, one of our most liberal states, who has Charlie Baker, kind of a middle-of-the-road Republican, again, very popular. And those seem to be kind of good governance states. I mean, would we benefit from perhaps that kind of dynamic in some of our bigger cities in terms of kind of more creative policy approaches? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm from the state of Maryland, and I know of Governor Hogan. And you characterize Maryland as being one of the more liberal states, but well, that depends upon whether or not you're in Maryland close to the D.C. area or Western Maryland going out toward Cumberland. You get to the Western Mountains, it gets to be a little bit different. Sure. But I'm not so sure that the rhetoric that's been getting used recently with certain destructive results. Where blue states that are governed by certain governors, which has given a green light, for example, to try and attempt to kidnap a governor and put her on trial. I think that irrespective of what party is going to be governing, that one, bipartisanship, to say a statement of the obvious, everybody desires that, I think, but the long history of governance by one party or another, it depends upon the individuals who are in those offices. For a long time in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, the Democratic machine in New York was utterly it controlled everything, but I wouldn't want to emulate it as a model of how to govern. On the other hand, you hear about the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill, who was a Democratic Speaker of the House, and Reagan, a Republican governor. They would lambaste each other, castigate each other. Same thing with Everett Dirksen. He was able to, somebody as a Republican senator would just vilify people on the floor, but then would be able to sit down and go out to have dinner with the person they were talking about, afterward. So there's something about, however, what they decide to do, that our legislators and the people that we choose, and what ultimately comes back to us, right? Because if we're not civil and we're not electing civil people, why should we expect them to do anything other than what we're doing ourselves? So I think in this current environment, we have reached low into the deepest, most vile bottom of the barrel, and scraped as hard as we can. And we've gotten exactly what we deserved, because that was the choice. So the fact that there's been such divisive, toxic language from the very top of the electoral map, from a chief executive, the only wonder for me is that it isn't worse than it has been, because it has been so intentionally divisive. It has been so intentionally poisonous. It's both so intentionally, destructive and demagogic. I think it's just a long tradition of democracy in this country, however it's operated either well or poorly or in between, that has kind of held the center such as it is.
But have we let sort of the current occupant in the White House kind of dominate the tenor of things? So I'm asking you about housing and education and, the economy.
Yeah.
Right? These really are matters for states and for cities, right? I think maybe we all are guilty of sort of that national obsession. Wouldn't, so many states, so many large cities really are just kind of a one-party government. Would we be better served by finding a way to have a little more, because in city halls in bigger cities, boy, these are not exercises in bipartisanship.
I don't have faith in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party when it comes to helping people of color. I know one tends to do more, especially around elections, than the other. But I agree with Fred on that. It depends on the individual. It really depends on the individual, and it depends on. We can all be racist. Whites can be racist, blacks can be racist. We can all be racist, but so it's a mentality that in America dominates in the background a lot of things. So for me, and it's the have and the have-nots. For me, I don't think that it's a party's going to fix the problem. I don't think there's going to be a party to fix the problem. I think people are going to have to fix the problem. And I'm especially concerned with Christian people, because I believe that we have the power and the ability with God Almighty to fix the problem, but we don't. We haven't. It doesn't mean that 'twas ever thus, 'twill ever be, but at this point of the game, we have not. And racism and the like is not a top priority. I don't think in any party, except during election time. I don't think that it's a top priority. We would see more. I looked at Holland, and we passed the LGBT bill, and in that it had teeth. It said that if you discriminate against the LGBTQIA, you will lose your business license, and you won't be able to run for public office. Now, how long have we had things for people of color, and they can say all kind of things, from the top down, and that hasn't happened. Why? Because America doesn't have the heart and the will to make something happen right now. It's a heart matter that we have to say, are we really willing to do what we need to do so that the sin of racism can be anathema to all of us, and we actually do something about it?
Yeah, there's so many things to react and respond to with that. I think we would do well to remember what George Washington said. I think it was a warning in his farewell address. I'm not positive about that. But he warned about political parties. And sure enough, it has come true. I think one of our biggest problems today is that we have forgotten what democracy is and how it works. Democracy does not work on the far right, and democracy does not work on the far left. Democracy has always and only works in the middle when nobody gets their way all the time. Mm-hmm. That's just a reality. You know, I'm an old government teacher, and that point is something that our parties, they're far more concerned with fear of losing contributors to their campaigns and fear of punishment from their leaders than they are with fear of not serving the people who elected them, who are supposed to be served. And until that changes, the parties are neither here nor there. Neither of them has done a good job. And if we're going to be honest historically, they flip-flopped a couple times in terms of whose interests they represented. Mm-hmm. But one thing that never actually happens from either party, we don't ever actually talk to the people that we're pretending we're going to fix the problems for. Which means we can't fix the problems because we don't actually know what they are. We haven't lived them. So how can you know what somebody else needs who's suffering just by saying, well, if you be like us, you won't have this problem? You need to talk to the people who are struggling to put food on the table. Talk to the people who can't make their rent. Talk to the people who are stuck in dropout factories for schools. Talk to them and find out what they need. And then sit down and work with them to try to come up with ideas that will really begin to address this. And I'll turn back for just one second on one other thing, because earlier we were talking about, how do you fix the housing and so forth. We know the answer to that. The answer is, and we've seen it right here in Holland, it's calmed down now. You cannot fix the housing problem until you put an end to white flight. Every time minority people start moving in, you move away. You know what? That is a no-win game, because we're always going to be right behind you as soon as we can come. Not because we care about living next to white people, but because we care about quality education for our kids, safe communities, the opportunity to have jobs where we can make a living. We want the same things. All parents want the same things for their kids. I don't care if they've got everything in the world or if they have almost nothing. We want our kids to have an opportunity to do just a little bit better than we did. Mm-hmm. Just go a little bit further, whatever that might look like. And it's not always socioeconomically. That's what we want. And we want the same things that you do. And people, we cannot make real progress until we answer the question of who's benefiting from it staying the way that it is. Because we do things that benefit ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm always amazed, all the way back to junior high, I think, what if every individual, every group in society really had the opportunity to reach their full potential and could contribute fully their gifts, personal gifts, but also their socioeconomic talents and benefits that are going to come from having that educational opportunity. And just imagine, we operate out of a base of fear. That's what drives us. Mm-hmm. That's what's driving this election. That's what has driven elections for a good while. It's especially there right now, and it's intentional. But the truth of the matter is, if we could look past our fear and see the potential. If everybody really had the opportunity to contribute, we could all have more.
I want to go back to something John said with the social justice. Why it fits in that this has to be bathed in social justice, because the opposite of that is social injustice. And if you don't believe that there's social injustice, you're not going to change. And in order to do social justice, the reason why I always bring it back to the Christ-centered Christians, because I know that we can do this. We can lay down our lives for our brethren. That takes a lot to sacrifice. And what we're really saying when we say we want equality and justice, you have to give up something. The South never recovered. When they realized that slavery was wrong, people lost their way of life. White people lost their way of life the way it was. When we're saying that we want social justice, that word justice, you have to, in your heart, know, I'm willing to lay down my life for my brother. I'm willing to lay down my white privilege. I'm willing to lay down the things that have been given to me. Not that you don't earn everything, but you have other things that are given, right? That you're going to have to lay down. You can't say this is my America. It's our America. There are things that are going to be taken away. Poor white people are happy that now I'm going to say this, but poor white people are happy in a sense with racism because they're not the lowest on the totem pole. They can look up at a businessman who's white and say, I'm better than them. At least I have something. If you take this from me, oh my God, where will I be? Right? There is a sacrifice to doing right. And we can't, like Jesus laid down his life for us, but it's hard for us to lay down our lives without him. And that's why I kind of always bring it back, because there is a cost. There is a cost to open it wide and to do what's just and what's right. And so I want to lay that out there, because sometimes we don't talk about it, but there is a cost, right? A lot of the professors here, and I like to put things in context, right? Because this isn't some ephemeral thing. We're talking about even at Hope College. There are people who've gotten raises and people who've gone up. They didn't do their best as a white person, but black people have to do, and people of color, so much to get less. And now you actually make it equal, they're going to lose something. They can't write on their name. They can't write on, it's really now ability to ability. I mean, if it was equal. And so there's a lot of things that would have to change. And the only way that you're going to be willing to do that is if Christ takes that hardness out of your heart to be able to do it. Otherwise, it is impossible.
David, let me address your question, because I've been sitting here pondering about this issue of governance, right? You mentioned Larry Hogan in Maryland. He's a good governor. He's a Republican. But, think about, what was the name of the governor we had before Governor Whitmer?
Rick Snyder.
Yeah. There's a Republican governor who presided over the Flint water crisis.
That's right.
There's a Republican governor in Florida right now. We got a full-blown pandemic who's been acting like it's business as usual pre-COVID.
Exactly.
No, but you have the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who like all politicians and people who govern, has its challenges. But given the size of California and the fires and the multiple crises that state has gone through, has done a pretty good job of responding to those. And all the governors, you know a lot about, you're a political scientist, so you know about federalism, the relationship between central and state governments. They have done as much as they can with the limited resources they've got as states, and the federal government has been absent from this whole crisis. So there's all of that, and so it's all tied together. And when we first started talking about this, it's natural to want to gravitate and to want to kind of land on an issue to try and explain a thing. But if you've been listening to John and Vicki Lynn and Jack, all this stuff is so seamlessly tied together.
Yes.
So if you're going to address one, you have to address the entire thing, which introduces the word system or systemic, right? When John was talking about people living together, it reminded me of something that happened when I was teaching at Malone College back in Ohio. I was teaching a class on 20th century U.S. history, and we were talking about white flight. And this one student, he said that his dad had been complaining to him because he said the neighborhood is going downhill. Well, apparently a black family had moved into the neighborhood. And so he says, Professor Johnson, my dad, was trying to figure out what can we do to stop that from happening. And so I looked at him and I said, you do see I'm black, right? But the whole class was predominantly white. And so I looked at the rest of them and I said, well, how many of the rest of you want to know how to keep black folks out of your neighborhood? Now, nobody raised their hand, but they all leaned forward. And I said, okay, if you want to keep black people out of your neighborhood, I'm going to give you the guaranteed USDA certified, gold-plated, for sure 100% method for keeping black folks out of your neighborhood. If you want black folks to stay out of your neighborhood, this is what you absolutely must do. You must make sure that black people have good police, good fire, good sidewalks, good job opportunities, good recreational opportunities. In other words, everything you want for your life, make sure they have it in their life. And I guarantee you they won't come live next door to you. Because see, it's never been about living next door to wonderful you.
That's right.
It's about having what you have. Because why would anybody leave where they are and move next door to you just to be harassed for living there, when if they could have the same thing you have where they are, they stay right there. You never have to see them. I said, that's what you got to do to keep black folks out of your neighborhood. But to do all of that, it's going to take some major changes in our system. And John mentioned Habitat for Humanity. I worked for it. When I was in seminary, I did my internship for Habitat for Humanity. And I always, I kind of always intellectually understood this, but until you find people that have, if you solve the home problem, somebody knows they have a home to go to, it's their home, it's safe, it's secure, then they can start thinking about other stuff like schools and maybe a second job or other things or vacation. But if you don't have the basic of a roof over your head and food on the table and some ability to predict the next day, then you are in survival mode and you're fighting against the system. And speaking of that system, forgive me, I'm an historian, so I had to mention this. You look at the way the economy changed after World War II. World War II revolutionized the American economy. We ramped up. America became the arsenal of democracy, and Michigan became the arsenal of the country that allowed it to become the arsenal of democracy. So there was a lot of production, a lot of overproduction. Technology changed. Things went to fast, high gear necessarily. By the end of World War II, we were living in a different world. And when GIs were coming back from World War II, it's already understood that for the new world, it's going to take a new kind of worker that was a lot more educated than the one that went off to World War II. Just in time for the beginning of the space race and the tech revolution with computers and all that. So the GI Bill made it possible for people to buy homes and to go to schools. Legislators in the Congress, particularly from the South, made sure that African American soldiers, veterans who, in many cases, who had landed at Normandy on D-Day and had fought through the hedgerows all the way to Paris or Berlin, did not get a chance to get those GI benefits. Now, that's just one example of, in this case, Southern Democrats, who were called Dixiecrats back then, who made sure that people who had been in uniform and put their necks on the line and had done their duty and fought for their country and served the Constitution were entitled to that, and not being able to buy a home meant that family wealth that Jack was talking about never got a chance to be established. And then we went into the 1950s, which of course was still an extended period of Jim Crow segregation, where depending upon you were, and you didn't have to be in the South, because we understand now that the North, in many cases, was even worse than the South, because at least in the South, they were honest about putting it out there. In the North, they had a very, very ingenious way of hiding it. So, up until 1964, 65, with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and don't even get me started about the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. Why do you have to have a Voting Rights Act in 1965 when you had a 15th Amendment? So there's so many things that happen, and we keep on having this conversation over and over and over again. And when it comes to voting, the one thing that every American citizen has for both First Amendment and as being able to speak their voice and being able to wield some power, small though it might be, no matter how large it And we've had to deal with voter suppression
Yes.
since forever.
But I also want to say for yours, when we did the GI Bill and all those things, we didn't call it welfare, right?
Yeah,
It's like saying, it's like, so now we want to do the same thing, which we should have done there, correcting a wrong, but then it's welfare, giving out a handout. When we, it's kind of like the same between militia and gang. When it's white,
Yeah.
it's a militia. When it's black, it's a gang.
Well, there's an author named Ira Katznelson who wrote a book entitled When Affirmative Action Was White.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's an old one.
And, I think about that very famous picture of, I think it was Huey Newton and the other guy standing on the steps of the California State Capitol back in 1968. They were wearing the berets, the black jackets, and they had weapons. Okay, they were exercising their Second Amendment rights, if you want to put it like that. I said to myself, what on earth would have happened if there had been a mass gathering of black folks on the Michigan State Capitol a few months ago? But
We
people
digress.
people can.
Can I try to get a
Yes.
little more
Yeah.
specific, right?
Yeah.
I appreciate all of this. Fred, you mentioned if you want people to stay out of your neighborhood, give them good services, right? Give them everything you have. And you mentioned policing, right? And this certainly has been.
Or don't give it to them. If not, okay, let's not use that language because when you
But
say
my point
give
is, I want to
somebody-
take us.
Right.
This was an issue that triggered, right? Really, sort of where we are today. And George Floyd was only the latest in a string
Right.
of these kinds of interactions with police. And so, right, so that's a specific issue that has really been on the front burner, and it does go to what you say, Fred, in terms of a community, right, feeling like they can be safe and live their lives, and that the police are, right, they're on their side, not against them. And so my specific question is, right, so we're having the debate. Here's a policy debate we're having around
Okay,
policing.
yep.
Right, and it's including, right, in my home city of Minneapolis, it was the entire city council signed on to a dissolution, right? So some of it's defunding the police, but they all were on board with dissolving the police. Now they backed away from that, in large part because we've had this significant spike in violence
Right,
in Minneapolis. That's happened in D.C., it's happened in New York City, it's happened in Seattle, it's happened in Chicago. I am not saying there's a causal relationship. That's too simple.
right.
But my question is, right, in terms of, black or brown communities, largely minority communities where this crime is happening, right, how deep do these kind of reforms, how deep do these moves with respect to police reform go? Or is this really... I've seen surveys where minority communities, a fairly high percentage, want a greater police presence. So what's the dynamic there? And then, to follow up on that, then what kind of changes need to happen in terms of that relationship between police and those they're policing?
Okay, I have never, when people started talking about defunding the police, I thought that was a bad idea.
Me too.
First of all, rhetorically, it just sounds insane.
Yes.
And more than that, I knew that the cynicism from certain corners of our government were going to take that and use it, just as another cudgel to prove that certain people were trying to destroy America.
Exactly.
All right. So good policing and policing a community and good policing are not mutually exclusive.
right.
It is possible to have police who are policing well and effectively, and even with great effectiveness, and not have it be bad policing. I've had my own issues with the police, as I told the story here at Hope College, but I'm a fan of the police because they have a tough, dirty job to do. Right? People commit crime, and we don't want a lawless society.
Thank you.
But on the other hand, when you start talking about these things, what the city council did in Minneapolis, the dissolution and all that, that was no.
It was embarrassing.
No. So,
I agree with that, and totally. I mean, that's not a solution to the problem. I think people forget sometimes, no areas have higher crime rates than the minority crime areas. And it's like who else are you going to call? Of course you're going to call the police. You're not going to call Ghostbusters, you know? I mean, you got to call the police. The problem is there's such a lack of trust.
Yes.
And I think, you know, I don't care what the profession is. Teaching, doctors, lawyers, police, there will always be some who are not what you hoped they would be. I think what makes it more difficult, and I have relatives who are police officers and have been police officers, and it's a really hard job. I believe that the average person goes to work and tries to do the best they can, and their great prayer as they leave every day is that they'll be able to come back, okay? And that's legitimate. But the thin blue line creates a real problem, because the fact that if you are afraid, and I think it's afraid more than unwilling, if you are afraid to turn in those that you know are bad officers and doing things that are worse than the criminals they're locking up, then you're going to have a problem. And that's a problem that has to be addressed, encouraged, rewarded. We have whistleblowers. I saw one yesterday or the day before. Somebody got a $114 million reward for being a whistleblower, you know? I mean, we got to step it up. And the other thing, I'll go ahead while I'm talking and just say one other quick thing, well, I'm going to say two. One, the makeup of the police force, just like the makeup of educators, needs to reflect the communities being served. Educators are terrible with this, and so are the police. And you need to fix that. And you say, well, okay, that's nice. How do you get some concrete proposals? Well, some of it isn't as far out or hard as you might think. You really want the police officers to be known in the neighborhoods they're policing. Okay? So create some good housing there and give them free housing and give them a bonus for living in that neighborhood. And let that develop, you know? It's kind of like with education, all the way back from when I was in 7th or 8th grade. I said, first thing you could do with projects is devote 1 or 2 floors within a big project to the schools. Let the students go to school right there rather than the danger of trying to go to school. And then the people who are drawing welfare checks, that spend half a day supporting their kids' education and half a day going to school themselves, so they have a better opportunity. I mean, I don't think this is rocket science. I think it's will.
But part of it is for the police. Police need to start policing their own. Right?
Yeah.
If you have bad teachers, you do something about it. You have a bad police officers, you do something about it. But there also has to be transparency. Like right now, a police officer can do something bad here and they get transferred to another precinct and their record doesn't go with them. Like we have to have some transparency in here so people can see this is a bad policeman. It doesn't make all policemen bad. But also the whole court system is bad. I was thinking about the Breonna Taylor case when the judge said that don't even consider murder or manslaughter charges against the police officers involved. That couldn't even be considered. Well, those are the kind of things that stack the deck against the police and which builds distrust in the police. And so I just wanted to read one, this is a quote from W.B. Du Bois, but it was so good about the police. It says, "Daily the Negro is coming more and more to look upon law and justice not as protecting safeguards, but as a source of humiliation and oppression. The laws are made by men who have little interest in him. They're executed by men who have absolutely no motive for treating the black people with courtesy or consideration. And finally, the accused lawbreaker is tried not by his peers, but too often by men who would rather punish 10 innocent Negroes than let one guilty one escape." And I think even though that was written back then for those of black folks, it's still very much prevalent today.
You know, David, I wish I could remember the name of the African-American scholar from New York who wrote a book about the work of minority communities in New York City in the 1990s during what people called the crack epidemic, they demanded more policing because at that point, with the drive-by shootings and the violence that was being generated by the crack wars and all that, competing territories and all that, and it was quite known in the early 90s that in some communities you could call the police, and they wouldn't come because they figured like, A, the community's not worth going in there, and B, it was dangerous. And so he's done this book, and he's got some backlash for it, because people thought, how can you say this about black folks, especially, the pendulum is swung the other way now, and people are talking about the terrible thing with mass incarcerations, and mass incarceration is a terrible thing. But what this guy is talking about in his book, his thesis was that, this wasn't some plot, that it was minority communities that wanted to be safe, and so they demanded more policing. And then, of course, it went the way that Vicky Lynn's talking about, where they went over that. Now we have another problem as a result of all that. So there's that part. So this notion that people in minority communities don't want to be safe and have some inherent beef against the police is not because they don't want to be safe. They want to be safe. In fact, if they're in a dangerous community, they want to be safe more than people in the suburbs. But then there was this other part that I remember from the 1990s too. There was always this question about how is it that somebody, somebody who's dealing crack in the neighborhood, in the inner city neighborhood, but you have some white person out there in the suburbs that has cocaine getting differences in the court.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically the same crime, but when one person shows up in front of the judge, it's one sentence this way, and if it's somebody else, the sentence goes that way.
Yes.
Now, either cocaine was illegal or it wasn't. But it turned out that crack and the gangster rap and all the stuff that, associated with it and the wars and all that sort of stuff, it created this entire social environment that became yet another extension of a legal system that, from the time of the end of the Civil War was criminalizing black life, right? Passing things like vagrancy laws, which made it you have to have a job, or else you're going to get arrested. You had to have a job in a community where you're not likely to have a job because people weren't going to hire a black person. Then if you do get arrested, you're in jail. If there's something happens inside of jail, and you magically have 18 months added onto your sentence, and they're not going to let you be in jail for free. So they put you out there to work on a railroad against your will, of course. So the railroad company is getting free labor and paying the state some fee. So there you are out on a chain gang, building a railroad. The state's getting paid money. The railroad company's getting rich. And then there you are. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but the definition to me of when somebody is making you work and not paying you against your will, that sounds like slavery to me. And so there's a wonderful documentary called Slavery by Another Name, which goes through the whole long history of that and the chain gang system that arose in the early 20th century. And
it's still present today.
And the fact that Du Bois is talking about, mentioning things like respect and dignity, there's more to policing than just stopping the crime. That, of course, is paramount, but it's also treating people with dignity and respect. That part's been missing as well.
And it's not a black and blue problem. I hate when people say that. It's an injustice problem that all of America suffers because racism is a cancer. And we might say America is great, like you see someone with cancer early stages and they're running around, but it will implode from within, right? We're not great. It's not a good thing. And that's what we're doing now. And all the things that you see of the racism episodes that you see more and more coming out, it's always been there. It's just because we have the internet and because we have police cams and because we have other ways that we can see it now, it's now prevalent for everybody. It's always been prevalent for me.
So we're getting down on time. Vicki Lynn, I want to come back to what you mentioned several times, which is people of faith and racism. And, what is to be done? What is the response of people and communities of faith? Hope College is, right, our mission is, our institution operates within the framework of the historic Christian faith.
We have to own it.
And so on our campus, in our community, as people of faith, as the church, what needs to happen? What needs to be done?
We have to own it. We have to recognize that this is a sin. And when you say something is a sin, you don't make excuses for a sin, right? When you say it's a sin and you realize that it hurts God's heart, right? When you realize that this is not, we want to please him. I mean, that's a bottom line for Christians at least, right? That we want to please him. And when you realize that he hates sin, and that when you realize that you can't play at it, this isn't a political issue. This is a heart issue, and it's something it's learned that we have to actually repent and then bring forth fruit in keeping with repentance. You know, we have to treat it honestly. It's not, I can't say enough that we have to humble ourselves. And, you know, people like to say First Chronicles all the time. If we, you know, Christians, people who are called by my name will pray and humble themselves and, you know, I'll fix the land, or whatever, however it goes. But notice it says our people. It's Christians. We have to stand up. We have to humble ourselves. It's not the heathen. It's not everybody else. We have a way. If God put Jews and Gentiles together, he can bring black and white. It's that we don't have a heart to do it. We have a hard heart. And we have a hard heart here at Hope College, which is why if we see someone who has a skill in math, we'll hire them, even if they might be racist, because racism is not important. Or we have these check boxes of things that we do to say, oh, we're going to do something for racism here. Here's a check box, which doesn't end up doing anything, right? And we don't care about the final product because it's just check boxes. We have to, it's a heart issue, and Hope College and, you know, is failing miserably when it comes to racism and the heart.
I have been thinking a lot. I have been quoting Frederick Douglass quite a bit on this issue, and particularly in reference to his narrative, because he draws a very hard distinction between Christianity and religion.
Yes.
And religion is one thing. Christianity has been packaged as a religion, but it is something vastly different. And he was very clear in his narrative that he could follow the Christianity of Christ all day, all night, anytime. But he said the Christianity of America, that was a different animal.
Yeah.
That was it.
And
The words of Christ, or how people had hijacked the words of Christ to justify trading and selling in the lives of men and women and children, beating people mercilessly, you know, serial rape, you know, and then preaching on Sundays about prostitution, all these things. So, you know, that tradition of that bifurcation of the religion versus the Christianity itself.
Yes.
And then when we were discussing about, you know, the amount of evangelical support what's been going on recently, you know what I think about? And I have fought within myself about, you know, should there have been something, is there still something I need to do about these kids who are separated from their parents? I'm wondering, why hasn't there been a bigger howl of protest? Okay, you don't like immigrants. Well, how about we look at them as human beings for a moment? You know, in the image of God, created in the image of God. We have a terrible history of separating children from their parents. In the first iteration, it was called 246 years of slavery and selling people off from their relatives. Then there was another instance in World War II. We separated Japanese families. And now we're separating immigrant families from their children. You know, I'm thinking about Joseph Welch during the Army McCarthy hearings when he finally asked on that one particular day, you know, when he said to Senator McCarthy, Senator, at long last, have you no shame? At long last, have we no shame in doing these kind of things? And this keeps happening over and over and over again. And, you know, but there are people who will go before the throne of God and be okay with that, apparently.
Cultural Christianity doesn't have any teeth.
And that's a segue to something that I think, you know, I want to say. I appreciate being here tonight and what we're doing here, but I do want to say very clearly, and I think we all realize that the line of demarcation on race in the United States has always been where black meets white, okay? but we're not the only ones who experience discrimination.
Oh, yeah.
The immigration issue, the treatment of Native Americans, Asian Americans. I mean, you could go on and on and on, and I think it's very important to acknowledge that. Now, the things that I would like to say as time winds down, this is something that I think about so much, and it's so annoying to me. I want to say straight out, the American flag does not belong to any race. It does not belong to any religion, and it does not belong to any denomination within a religion or anything like that. The American flag belongs to all of us. So stop wrapping yourself in that. All of my uncles, every last one of them served in World War II. My dad served in World War II. My other uncle served in the Korean War. I have a son who's in the Guard right now as someone who's going to retire from the Guard. I mean, that history has been there from the beginning, you know? So that flag doesn't belong to any one group. I don't care how much you wrap yourself up in it. And then I'm going to go further and say something that bothers me even more. The Bible does not belong to any one race.
It's true.
It does not belong to any one denomination or sect of Christianity. Okay? And then finally, I'm going to say that in many ways, and this is going to sound harsh, but in many ways, if we look at the actual history of the church's practice as it relates to race, and thereby what we have called Christianity, which I really don't think it is, like Fred said, I think that in many ways we might have been better off if the church had literally said nothing.
Yeah, we bashed
Because
it
they have
Christianity.
contributed to and enhanced the problem. I'm not saying every church. There are some
we
churches
understood.
who have done good work, continue to work. I'm not saying every group. But, you know, let's be honest. Some of the most hateful things that we have ever heard have come from the pulpit. So I'm going to stop there for time's sake.
Yeah, I'm still not sure I'm helped out
Yeah.
on what I as a Christian should do and what my church should do.
Oh,
Lots of historical things. So we have had 3 minor independent refugee children, one from Africa, one from Honduras, one from Guatemala. I'm told by Ibram Kendi that I'm a white colonizer for doing that. That's where his anti-racism leads. I go to a church, or have gone to a church, I would guess they probably vote conservative, and yet it's a church that comes around, they've come around refugee families like you would not believe. I'm an evangelical. I blanch at the 80% support for Donald Trump. I also grieve that the other party has staked out in extreme positions on issues that prevent my kind, right, from voting that way, from abandoning someone who they find objectionable on a level of personal character. Right? And so I do think, yeah, I understand everything that's being said historically. Absolutely.
So let's not speak historically.
But there are, I do think, a lot of sort of good-hearted people and churches are sort of stuck in this divide where they are a reflection of a society that is segregated, right? Or kind of people sort of live with their own, by their own. And so I think there are a lot of good intentions where it's just, how do we get over that? So I'm kind of looking for some, like, really sort of practical things. How can we Christians who share Christ and our ultimate identity in Christ, how do we move the ball forward?
Let me quote Tom Bogert from Western Theological. You know, he taught a class when he said, you know, that before creation, God was completely fine existing in darkness before he said, let there be, right? We think darkness is a bad thing. When you look at it from that standpoint, he totally changed my understanding of that. That it was there, but then he said, let there be light. And the cross, as a practical matter, can be a unifier. As Christians, we have to learn to live within the tension of not everybody's going to see things our way, that it's possible for you, a white guy, to have immigrant children and not be castigated by it. One of the things that really, when I think some people made fun of Mitt Romney when he had, I think he had a child of color, and there was a backlash against that, and there should have been, because that was a child. No, not a particular child of a different race, but that was a child that needed a home and love, and I was happy about that. So we had to do this in a kind of way where the cross is the great unifier to bring communities together. The cross is the great unifier, where we had to live within the tension of disagreement, and that kind of disagreement and that kind of challenge of tough issues and whatnot. But we do it in a way where, as everything else we've been talking about, where we model Christ, right, who disagreed with a lot of people, and got angry on occasion. And so that way I can celebrate you in doing what you're doing. I can celebrate your church and what you're doing and whatnot. And that, like John said, that the Christian church, that the cross doesn't belong to black people or white people, it belongs to Jesus. And in that respect, where people are doing something correct and serving him, I've been telling people, my boss is a Jewish carpenter, and not any party. And if we can finally wrap our minds around that, all right, and understand that parties are a thing that we live with, because like James Madison said, if men were angels, there wouldn't be any need for government. Men are not angels, but there's government humankind and there's government celestial kind, and that's who we're. If we can finally do less about rooting ourselves in the identity of America or inside of my skin, and identify more as a citizen of heaven, which on the one hand sounds crazy, right? Very optimistic, very utopian, but on the other hand, that's real.
Yeah.
That's where we're destined. And so as that citizen, I can celebrate you as a brother and do so.
Yeah, thanks for this. That's a great sermon, Fred. That's a great sort of note to end on. And like that you use the word brother, because we are brothers and sisters. We are kin because we're children of God, right? And so we, right, as Hope College, as fellow believers, we have resources that should be leading the world, right? We believe that each one of us and every single person on the face of this earth is sort of stamped in the image of God.
We
take that for granted.
To not let that world overwhelm our hope in Christ.
Right. So that's a powerful thing, right? That means every person is of inestimable worth and value.
Right.
And
But I hate
I like
that-
to think we have the great reconciler who has reconciled us to him and to each other. That's our mission. That's our calling, and I think, we need to hold that. So this has been a terrific evening. I appreciate your perspectives and your wisdom and your passion, all four of you. Thanks to Student Congress for hosting this.
Yes.
Be agents of peace in the week ahead. This is going to be. I'm sure there will be unease, and again, we have shalom in Christ, and we take that with us. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.